Hey guys, we're going to continue our discussion of the Great Depression today. We're going to be moving quick. We're going to talk about how the Great Depression develops, how it dovetails with an ecological disaster called the Dust Bowl that intensifies the suffering felt by the American people. We're also going to talk about Hoover's reaction or lack of reaction to the Great Depression during his administration. It kind of leads to this change in philosophy of government that we'll see occur during the 1930s. So after the crash of the stock market in 1929, basically other flaws in the economy helped sink the nation into the Great Depression, which was the worst economic downturn in history. Stock market collapsed, draining the resources of banks. Many failed, creating more anxiety. And when banks had little cash on hand, they were vulnerable to runs, or when nervous depositors would all go and try to withdraw their money in the same day. And this could drain a bank of all its cash and force its closure. So in the months after October 1929, bank runs basically caused hundreds of banks to fail, including the Bank of the United States itself. Bank closures wiped out billions in savings by 1933. Of course, today now we have insurance from the federal government that protects deposits, and laws require banks to keep a certain percentage of their assets on hand in cash to be paid out to depositors as well. Also, you had farm failures widespread during this time. Farmers, as is usually the case, get the worst of the economic downturn. Joblessness and poverty cuts demand. People simply eat less. And basically, farmers were unable to sell the food they produce. Farm prices sank, or food prices sank to half of their already low levels from 1929. Lower prices meant lower income. And farmers who had borrowed money to pay for land and equipment couldn't sell it, couldn't pay their loans back. And basically you had hundreds of thousands of farm disclosures that occurred in the first 5 years of the Depression. Of course, foreclosure is when a lender takes over ownership of a property when they fail to make loan payments, in this case mortgages. So the following year, 1930, saw a sharp drop in economic activity, steep rise in unemployment, and this creates a cycle that feeds on itself. By 1933, the GNP had dropped over 40% from its pre-crash levels. So almost half of the nation's production was destroyed. Unemployment reached a staggering 25%, and in some groups the numbers were even higher. For instance, the African American neighborhood of Harlem, 50% of the people that lived there were unemployed in 1932. Of course, the true measure of the Depression lies in how it affects the American people. Thousands of people had applied for a handful of jobs, and job loss really resulted in poverty for most Americans. And to survive, people begged door to door. They relied on soup kitchens, bread lines, and some simply went hungry. Some who lost their homes lived in what were called shanty towns that were often called Hoovervilles, and these were named after President Hoover, many of whom many people blamed for the devastation of the Depression. You also had the advent of the hobo. Most were men, middle-aged men, but also some teens and women, and even families engaged in this activity. But basically, they would ride the trains from town to town looking for odd jobs and food and things of that nature. Of course, this was illegal. They were often chased away or beaten by guards or police officers. Also, it was very dangerous. Many hobos were killed or maimed from being hit or run over by trains. Finding food was a constant challenge because most people didn't have much to give in the first place, and they rarely shared with hobos. So hobos developed a system of sign language to warn other hobos of possible dangers or opportunities. So, say that a hobo did work for a family and they didn't get paid. They might put a symbol somewhere around the family's property to warn other hobos that this person wouldn't pay you for work. Or if there was a person that was particularly friendly and would feed you, they would put a symbol that indicated that. The worst impact, though, was the emotional, the psychological impact of the Great Depression. It really was a blow to the psychology of Americans. Unemployed people felt ashamed oftentimes. Accepting handouts troubled them even more, and often led to even more shame and despair. Suicide rates spiked during the Great Depression at much higher levels than normal. Of course, anger was another common emotion. People felt like, they had been working hard, doing the right things their entire lives, and it turns out to be the working class and really the middle class that bears the burden of the Depression. So many lash out in anger. There's lots of labor violence and riots and things of that nature that occurred during the 1930s. The economic problems of the Depression were exacerbated by an unparalleled environmental issue that occurred. In 1931, basically, rain stopped falling throughout much of the Great Plains. And the drought actually lasts for several years. Millions of people had fled the area by the time the rains really came back. And this was made worse by agricultural practices that had been that were going on at the time. Land that had been covered with grass was now bare. There was no vegetation, root systems to hold the soil in place. So when windstorms came, they stripped the topsoil and blew it hundreds of miles, sometimes as far as the Atlantic coast, the east coast of the United States. And this dust, when it settled in other places, would choke out crops, bury farm equipment, blow into windows and under doors. And year after year, this continues to happen. And the hardest hit areas were Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas. They become known as the Dust Bowl. And in fact, thousands of children especially and elderly die of inhaling all of this dust. It becomes a plague of sorts on Plains families. My grandmother once told me a story about when she would leave her family's farm to catch the school bus to go to school during those days, that every morning it seemed like the ground was a different color because basically dust had blown in from somewhere else and settled on the ground. So, huge, massive problems for farmers during this time. So as a result, many people just left the Dust Bowl. By the end of the 1930s, 2.5 million people had left the plains along Route 66 to California, settling in camps and working on farms there. Migrants were often called Okies because many were from Oklahoma, but they came from many states. Many of them also met hardship and discrimination. Of course, the plight of the migrants does kind of capture the imagination of America's artists. So you've heard of John Steinbeck, who wrote Grapes of Wrath, or singer-songwriter Woody Guthrie, who wrote about the plight of the people, kind of the birth of American folk, modern American folk music. For much of the decade, the Depression, however, defied most government efforts to defeat it, and Americans basically had to defend for themselves during this time. The fact that Americans felt like they were on their own had a lot to do with Hoover's philosophy of government. He believed that basically government should have as little intervention in the economy as possible, and he believed that more government threatened the prosperity and the spirit of the American people, which he called rugged individualism. He thought that if the government was too involved, it would limit Americans' ability to forge ahead as individuals and rugged individuals. And he opposed government intervention. He didn't reject all government oversight, but he thought it was important not to destroy people's belief in their own power and responsibility. So individualism didn't rule out cooperation. He believed in what was called the associative state, in which government and businesses basically should cooperate in voluntary associations. He was Secretary of Commerce. He put those beliefs into actions and called together meetings of business leaders and experts and talked about way of achieving national goals. Hoover Dam is a perfect example of this. The dam harnesses the Colorado River to provide safe, reliable water supply and electricity to over 7 western states. The federal government provided the funding for the project, and a group of 6 independent companies joined together to design and construct. This is a good example of the associated state. However, he did believe that government shouldn't provide direct aid, and this becomes a problem, as he believes in voluntary action. So he urges business and governments not to lay people off, but that doesn't happen. So as businesses cut jobs and wages, basically local governments also cut programs because they're getting less tax revenue. So finally, Hoover does go against his belief and establish the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in 1932. It's a program that provides $2 billion in direct government aid to banks and institutions. But a lot of people were upset because he's giving aid to banks and companies, but not to the people. He also signs into law the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was intended to raise the price of imported goods and make people more likely to buy American goods. Unfortunately, it was a disaster because what it does is it raises prices of goods across the board. European nations respond with their own tariffs and basically destroys international trade, leading to higher prices and even tougher times for Americans. The bigger problem for Hoover is there was a credibility gap. You know, he was saying that the economic foundation was sound and that things were going to turn around, that, you know, anytime things were going to get better. And as the months and years dragged on, the Americans saw this kind of cheerleading as ridiculous, and they didn't believe him anymore. They didn't think that he understood what was going on. And they also didn't see him as relating to or caring about their needs and concerns. The fact that he would give direct relief to banks and companies but not directly to the people reflected poorly on how much he actually cared for the American people. This perceived lack of feelings was only reinforced by his reaction to the bonus marcher. May 1932, a lot of World War I veterans set up a camp near the Capitol. They were there to pressure the federal government to pay a veterans bonus basically early. The bonus was not due for many years, but because the depression was so great, many of these veterans had demanded that the government go ahead and pay it. In July, basically, he sends in police and the U.S. Army to clear the camps, and violence erupts. Basically, the camp itself goes up in flames. Hundreds are injured, and Hoover was seen as, you know, the bad guy. He sent the U.S. Army to basically force veterans to leave the nation's capital. And this is certainly a problem, and the public opinions of Hoover continues to collapse. Hoover continued to anger people when he pushed for a large tax increase in 1932 in an effort to try to balance the budget and cut spending. And voters wanted more government spending to aid the poor, and this only further slowed the recovery. And so in 1930, congressional election provided early signs that the public was fed up with Hoover. Democrats won a majority of seats in the House of Representatives and made gains in the Senate as well. And by the 1932 presidential election, basically Hoover's chances of re-election were all but null or nil. And as the Depression showed few signs of ending, Hoover's ability to influence people and events was nearly gone. And he's essentially a lame duck before he even loses his re-election bid to FDR. Of course, we're going to talk about FDR and his actions in the next video. We'll talk about how his spirit of his optimistic spirit is going to buoy the American people, and even if the New Deal is not successful in ending the Great Depression, it certainly gives people a more positive view of the government and its leadership, and is going to lead to a more optimistic approach to American life during this time. So we'll talk about the New Deal in our next video. See you guys.